their ability to assert their identity and who they are as a people, we say that this is abhorrent, that you cannot stand for that. What do we support on proposition? First, we notice that this debate happens in places where the indigenous culture was colonized and suppressed. This happens both in the Anglosphere, that is to say countries such as New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and the US, but also in other places such as Japan, such as Taiwan, such as large swathes of Africa where groups like the Zulus conquered the neighboring African tribes. Secondly, we say that when governments use indigenous cultures to promote tourism, that looks like tourism ads of indigenous people on reserves doing things such as doing primitive things such as dancing around fires because governments want to capitalize on how exotic and how savage these peoples are. Third, we say that we're happy to support indigenous people themselves promoting their culture, and we're happy to support objective representations of their culture, that is to say, representations in places like museums, but we're not happy with the government specifically using their culture for tourism and for profit. Okay, 3 points of substantive. One, on why the representation is likely to be tokenistic cultural appropriation. Secondly, on why that's principally bad. And thirdly, on how it decreases political capital for legislative change and it hides the atrocities that were perpetrated against these groups. Firstly, on why the representation is likely to be cultural appropriation. The first piece of context I want to note here is a lot of states were incredibly violent in their treatment of indigenous people. That is to say, in places like Canada and the US, by systems of colonial violence, these indigenous groups have been basically wiped out. And I think it's important to note that these are the countries in which this debate is most relevant. This is the key context for this debate. That is to say, in places where indigenous groups are the most vulnerable, are the least able to assert themselves, are the least likely to promote their culture, that is when the government has the most power. That means that this debate happens in places where the indigenous groups are the easiest to manipulate, like the US, like in Canada. Comparatively, in places with better race relations like New Zealand, the Maori are able to promote their own culture. They don't need the government to help. That means that this debate is probably less relevant in places with better race relations. Already notice that this debate happens in places where the indigenous group is very vulnerable. Second thing I want to notice is that in a lot of countries, the indigenous group is often segregated from government and society through systems of colonialism and racism. I think what all of this means is that the representation is likely to be incredibly bad for three reasons. One, because the government doesn't engage with the indigenous community at the point where the indigenous community has very little representation within the government and when they're economically and politically disenfranchised. Secondly, because notice that tokenism is the easiest way to do representation because it's very cheap, it's very simple, it's very easy, it's very quick. It's very easy to sell a very distinctive narrative of Native American people as people who wear headdresses and have dream catchers, right? We think that this is the kind of narratives that are going to exist. Third, notice that there's often very little backlash when the representation is done badly because these indigenous groups have been politically disengaged, have been politically disenfranchised. It means that therefore their backlash is unlikely to be heard by broader society. But I also want to note here that a lot of the time these societies are incredibly conservative, right? Like Japan, which colonized Okinawa, is probably not going to admit its fault in colonizing Okinawa. I think a lot of Americans are very proud of American identity. They don't really care about Native American identity. Therefore, these states, these populations aren't really susceptible to backlash. I think what that means is that representation is going to be highly tokenistic and incredibly inaccurate. I think the harms here are twofold. One, we perpetuate bad stereotypes about these indigenous people at the point where we just point them as savages. But secondly, we dehumanize these people. That is to say, when you say that these people are nothing but savages, then when they have disproportionate crime rates, when they have disproportionate poverty rates, the obvious explanation is that they deserve it. Right? We shape the discourse about these people in ways that are massively harmful. Secondly, then, on why it is principally bad to misrepresent these people in this way. I think there's a triple principal harm here. First, there's a loss of property. That is to say, it is your culture, but it is taken by another culture who is using it to profit. I think that in itself violates your right to property of that culture. Secondly, there is a loss. There is a failure to fulfill the government's duty of redress. That is to say, the government literally beat your ancestors for speaking the Maori language in school, but now they want to use the Maori language to make themselves profit. I think that in itself deserves some sort of redress that is missing. Third, there's a loss to the right you lose your right to get the revenue that your culture generates. That is to say, when the government uses your culture to get more tourism money, that tourism money is probably taxed by the government, so it goes to the government, or it goes to government agencies, government-sponsored airlines. That means that the indigenous people actually never get the money. Comparatively, when you let indigenous people do the promotion, they're the ones who have sole proprietorship of that culture. They're the ones who make money of that culture. That's incredibly good. Thirdly, then, before I move on, I'll take a POI.
How does your side propose that they would get money into indigenous people's pockets directly, if not through tourism?
I think these indigenous, well, because there's like merchandise that these indigenous people can like sell themselves. I don't see why that's exclusive. Okay. Thirdly, on why we decrease political capital for legislative change and we hide atrocities when you let governments misrepresent these groups like this. This argument comes in two prongs. Firstly, we say that government misrepresentation makes people feel like the indigenous people are actually doing okay in society. The second thing is that when governments misrepresent these groups, it overruns the discourse, which actually reveals how badly these people are treated. On the first prong, I think people have a falsely rosy impression of these indigenous rights for four reasons. One, because when the indigenous group is literally smiling on government tourism posters, I think it's very likely for you to think that these people are okay, that they approve of the government. Secondly, when the government puts these groups on their posters, I think it gives the impression that the government is working to include these groups and therefore rights are advancing. Third, because people don't recognize the tokenism, so they don't understand the representation is bad. Four, notice that the portrayal of these groups in tourism is likely to be much better than in reality. That is to say, you do not show the structural racism that Maori people go through. You only show them happy because happiness gets you tourism dollars. So the second thing to say is that misrepresentation overruns the discourse about indigenous groups. That is to say, for these ads to be effective, they have to be everywhere. You have to have ads everywhere about Maori people being happy. That overruns any discourse about like why Maori are doing really bad. Why does this then decrease political capital? Three reasons. Firstly, notice that there's an inherent tension between the governments using indigenous groups as a selling point and governments like admitting their past wrongs, because they cannot admit that these people have disproportionately high crime rates while also saying these people are a selling point of our nation. You should come to see them. They cannot say that we genocided these people, but we're also profiting off these people, that you should use these people as a reason to come and see that. We think therefore you decrease the government's ability to put in systems of redress. Secondly, we say that it gives right-wing commentators examples to point to. Right-wing commentators can say, look, our society is inclusive of these people. When these people agitate, it's not because they're doing badly, it's because they're asking for extra, right? Third, because it gives confirmation bias. That is to say, when your first impression of these indigenous groups is seeing them positively represented on a billboard, you think that they are okay. You are therefore more likely to look at stories about them doing okay in society. Therefore, you're less susceptible to people telling you that actually there are systemic problems of racism at play. I think when you decrease political capital so massively like this is when you really screw over these indigenous groups if you care about their well-being. Propose.
Awesome, thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up the first negating speaker to open their team's case.
I will start my speech in 10 seconds. In this debate, the key stakeholders are the Indigenous people of the colonised world. We support using their cultures for the promotion and marketing of tourism because we see that these Indigenous cultures become part of a country's national identity. We see benefits for the Indigenous people themselves, and we make sure that the government is held accountable. That is why today I am proud to oppose. We will prove that we get better social and economic outcomes for Indigenous people. This will win us the debate because Indigenous people are the stakeholders here today, and they're the ones that we must benefit. I'll go through a few points of rebuttal, then my 2 points of substantive, firstly on the cultural benefits for Indigenous and others, and secondly on the economic benefits for the Indigenous people. Firstly, on my rebuttal, the affirmative talked about how using these Indigenous cultures for tourism will create bad stereotypes. On our side of the house, Indigenous people are being shown overseas. They are being shown to people to encourage them to come into our country, and they're being shown within the country to support tourism. That shows that country using them are not ashamed of them. They are proud and they are willing to use them as the face of their country to attract people to come there. This is not a bad stereotype. Secondly, the affirmative talked about how it will take the culture away from the Indigenous groups. As I will prove more in my first substantive point, culture for tourism is used in a positive way that integrates Indigenous culture into society, and it will become a part of the nation's identity. And finally, affirmative also, the opposition characterised the world in which Indigenous people are only heard through the government. This is a very unfair characterisation. It is not true. Indigenous have a voice, not just through the government. This characterisation is frankly offensive to Indigenous cultures. Firstly, my first point of substantive, a cultural point. It improves the perception for foreigners and locals of the Indigenous within that country. Firstly, what does this look like as the status quo in a country where this doesn't happen? Well, we see Indigenous people not even acknowledged or looked at as being part of the people of the land. They don't have a strong association with the national identity. For the role of the Indigenous people within this country, this creates tremendous flow-on effects because they aren't the issues aren't discussed, perhaps they're not looked at in elections, etc. This is how we fix it on our side. Firstly, Indigenous people can make the comparison between the way they are treated and the way they are portrayed and use this to negotiate with the government. Māori can go to the government and say that they have done this in the past, say that they're using their symbols for Air New Zealand. We would like to be, you're using our symbols, we would like to not be over-policed. We would like to be given X right within our communities. This bargaining power is a benefit most likely to happen on our side of the house and is a positive outcome. On the comparative, take for example USA, where Indigenous identity is not a huge part of tourism. There is not a stake for government to stop oppressing people. Secondly, people take pride in national symbols. When the All Blacks do the haka, people appreciate it and they identify with it because it is the symbol of their country. Because of things like this, kapa haka is promoted and participated more within schools, and this sends an effect to the entire national culture, and it changes the viewpoint on these Indigenous cultures. It makes Māori culture something to take pride in. Thirdly, because Māori culture is so well represented overseas, for example, the All Blacks or Air New Zealand, we get the rest of the world wanting to engage with that culture, such as the game Apex Legend, which is an American developed game which now has a Māori character. This is a direct result of Māori culture being well perceived overseas. Not only does this have benefits that I will address in my second substantive point to the Indigenous side of to the economic side for the Indigenous people. For Indigenous diaspora, this is powerful to see. It's really powerful to see your culture being represented in foreign countries. You see your culture being appreciated. A, it makes the general public perception better in these countries of Indigenous people, and B, it increases the likelihood that you will have stars come from these cultures because they are recognisable in other parts of the world. How bizarre, for example, because of the recognisability of the Māori accent in this hit, it became a worldwide sensation, and it allows other people to follow in their footsteps, such as Benny producing albums in Māori. Fourthly, in USA, Native Americans are able to go to the government and say, look at how New Zealand treats the Māori people. See how they have become a symbol of their culture. Why hasn't the same happened here? What are the effects of this? It creates a drive for activism because people are realizing their status in comparison to other Indigenous cultures. And they are realizing that a change can be made. I'll now take a POI.
In a place where the Indigenous people have little to no power, how was the populace going to react when Indigenous people try to make national symbols? How are conservative people going to react when the Indigenous people of America try to become national symbols?
Well, at this stage, when they're not recognized at all, people aren't going people probably won't like it. However, if we see, like in New Zealand, where they are being representative, where they are being used as the face of the country, people take pride in that culture. We now see the haka, we now see symbols out in the world, and we think, yeah, that's our country. We appreciate that these people are fighting for their rights, and that is because they are used for the promotion of tourism. My second point of substantive on an economic benefit: tourism brings massive revenue for Indigenous businesses. Tourism always benefits the country's economy, but tourism promoted using Indigenous culture benefits the Indigenous themselves. When you come to New Zealand on the basis that you like the way Māori culture is portrayed, you are likely to visit places like the Rotorua Māori village, a place where profits are taken directly back to Indigenous communities. How do we see this working? One, the promotion of this culture leads to more people coming into it specifically for the reason of that culture, which means that people are likely to want to participate in Indigenous business more, which of course brings higher revenue for these businesses. Because of the way the liberal order works, Indigenous people can demand revenue for their brands. Example, Air New Zealand. This is a massive source of income for these businesses and a huge benefit on our side of the house. Outcomes of this we see is that it invites all types of people to visit the country, those of lower economic situations who want to experience the culture, and those more wealthy who can spend money there. What is money in Indigenous communities look like? Where does it go? Realistically, it will go to funding meals for children in poverty. It goes to civil rights cases so people can fight for more rights. And this is helped again by our cultural point, because it means that these cases are more likely to be won. It goes to building up more iwi businesses so they can bring in more revenue. It improves the socio-economic status of these people in the country. And this is a massive thing which we solve on our side of the house. On their side of the house, we see a complete dismissal of Indigenous people in the public eye. They can claim Indigenous will be heard, but tourism is something which is promoted pretty much everywhere, and it is what people will see. We can use tourism as a way to get Indigenous culture out there, to get their voices heard, to get them recognised as a key part of society and a main part of a nation's identity. Acknowledgement is better than being disregarded. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up the second affirmative speaker to continue their team's case.
Am I audible? I'll take POIs through the chat or visually. No audibles, please. Sorry? Oh, yeah, okay. Where am I at? The negating team wants to win this debate by place setting in New Zealand and naming all New Zealand examples, when Michael has already told you why. This move is less relevant in countries like New Zealand, where there are already good race relations, and Indigenous people such as the Maori are able to portray themselves and are able to actually have their own voice. That's why this move is more relevant in countries such as Japan, such as America, when these Indigenous people have no political capital, when they have no voice, and when these conservative countries are unlikely to engage with good portrayals of these Indigenous people and are likely to just tokenize them, stereotype them, and otherwise just profit off of their culture, which is principally horrid, and we do not stand for that on this side of the house. So 3 things to do in my speech today. First, on portrayal / social outcomes for Indigenous people, and secondly on profit / money economic outcomes for these Indigenous people. And I'll bring you a split on how Indigenous people become locked out of their own culture because of the government promotion of their culture for advertising for tourism. So onto the first thing, which is portrayals in a social context. So what do they try to tell you here? They try to tell you that like, even if these portrayals are damaging, they're international and as such they don't matter. Well, firstly, we tell you that these portrayals are not, tourism is not necessarily strictly international. You can have domestic tourism as well. So we think that the government will try to like have these advertisements within New Zealand as well. And even if it's not within their own country, and even if it's not, we think that like having these negative portrayals apply internationally still is damaging. That doesn't mitigate the damage that is caused to these people because of negative portrayals. Secondly, they've told us like these portrayals will be good because they're portraying because proud. Secondly, two responses to this. Firstly, this doesn't engage with with Michael's mechanism as to three mechanisms as to why this is like really there's incentives for these portrayals to be bad. So to remind, there's three mechanisms. First, they don't really engage with these indigenous communities in countries such as America, such as Australia. They're not engaged with, and as such, these portrayals are unlikely to be inaccurate. Secondly, we think that it's like very cheap and easy to stereotype for the government. It's very, very easy to like portray this like unitary image of a culture rather than like have nuance. And that's the simpler thing to do. And as such, this is the path of least resistance. So we think the governments are likely to do that. And finally, there's no really backlash mechanism operating on these governments either, because there's in more conservative countries where the general population doesn't really care about indigenous issues, and as a result, and these indigenous people have less voices. So if you portray them negatively, there's no really backlash on the government politically, socially, whatever. And as a result, the government has no incentive to portray them well. So, and even then, even if they think like, oh, the main argument here is like these portrayals like being spread around is good because it spreads the culture and that leads to more acceptance. Two things to this. Firstly, it's contingent on them proving that there's good portrayals, which they really didn't mechanistically like do well, because they've tried to like characterize all governments as the New Zealand government, which like we have better race relations here and actually engage in indigenous issues, and that's not true for like a general functioning democracy. And secondly, we think that like even if you get these portrayals and they're like decent, right? It's still whitewash. Like we see the white people doing the haka, and as a result, that like isn't necessarily the best portrayal of these cultures because it's whitewash, and as such, it's not necessarily positive. And so at the end of the day today, they don't really engage with how negative stereotypes are spread, because it's really, really easy to. Like, it's really easy to stereotype people as being exotic. And that's like the general thing that we think will happen here. They're trying to attract tourists because it's like, oh, we have this exotic culture. Come see these like exotic savage people who like still haven't like progressed into modern technology. Come look at this. And we think that like that's the portrayals that are likely to happen under their side of the house. And we think that that's absolutely damaging and unacceptable. And we cannot, and that has wider damages for these people as at large, because it's used to justify unjust treatment. And we think that that's absolutely damaging and we cannot stand for that. So then on the economics. So what have they tried to tell you here? They basically just tried to tell you that like these tourists will come in and see these indigenous people, and as a result, they'll be able to profit off of it. We think that this is really unlikely because we all acknowledge that like indigenous people are like resource starved. They're not likely to be very rich. They're not likely to have a lot of like political, social capital or clout. And as a result, we think like when these tourists come, they don't go to these indigenous businesses. Where do they go? They go to like the government museum or like other like white people places that have more promotion, have more advertisement, and like have more control over like objects because simply of them being more wealthy and having more like clout. And we think that like the people coming in aren't necessarily like the most like engaging in like these type of cultures as well, because they would likely just like see this participate in exoticism and think that these people are like exotic to be looked at rather than like engaging with them as humans. So we think that as a result, they're like more likely to visit other white portrayals of these people, and that's absolutely damaging because we think that as a result they have no profit in this. And we think that general tourism, they engage with like white businesses, white restaurants, white hotels, and so all of this, like the vast majority of profit are going towards white people rather than these indigenous people. And we also think that like they give points about how like this will be better for them because it gives them more political capital. So we first again only think this works in New Zealand, where there are actual race relations, where the white people are generally like accepting to like having indigenous culture portrayed as like a dominant culture in our media. And we also think that like tourism as a whole isn't entirely reliant on indigenous issues as well. They have other promotions that happen across these countries. Like it won't be indigenous people getting all of the limelight either. And we think that, like, what does this look like? This looks like Americans having like really, really big backlash when you try to make pushes about Indigenous people, like when Indigenous people try to like want more, because it's like, oh, we're already portraying you, or like we're already promoting you. Why are you wanting more? Why are you like making such a hassle out of it? And we think that conservatives will push back, and that will lead to worse treatment for Indigenous people on an economic and political level, which leads to worse outcomes for them. So at the end of that point today, we think that like the economic benefits do not exist for these Indigenous people, and even then, and at worst, it's like backwards on them because there's backlash. I'll take a POI now.
Surely, if Indigenous people are getting public view, they would take advantage of getting authentic perception. How can you prove that they would be portrayed negatively?
We already gave you like a lot of mechanisms as to why it's really, really easy to portray anything negatively, because it's more simple and less nuanced and more profitable for these governments. As a result, they'll get negative portrayals, they'll not get any political capital, and it'll be really, really terrible for them, and we cannot stand for that. So then onto my split on how Indigenous people become locked out of their own culture. So the best case scenario where they do get like heightened awareness and interest in this culture, which we don't think happens. This will lead to commercialization, which will lead to like more media, TV shows, hairdressers, whatever, being sold in regards to these Indigenous people. What happens then? We think white producers will take over these mediums for 4 reasons. Firstly, because they have more resources, such as money. Secondly, because they have more audience, they have more clout and comfort from the white people who like to consume things made by other white producers. And thirdly, we think they have more profit incentive because Indigenous people don't naturally want to necessarily profit off their own culture, while big media companies would. And fourthly, we think it's more accessible because they have for them to create media, because it's more existing infrastructure for these white people. And as a result, this is bad because of 4 reasons as well. It results in bad portrayals, because Michael's already told you why bad portrayals are really, really simple and easy to do. Secondly, even if it's not bad, it's whitewash, and it's held in more value than Indigenous voices, and that drowns out their voices. And thirdly, you think that even if it's good, the profit goes back to the white people, and as a result, there's no benefit for Indigenous people here. So Indigenous people lose out on their culture, lose out on their voice, lose on control, and lose out on their property, and that's why we cannot stand for this, and we absolutely are proud to propose. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up the second negating speaker to continue their team's case.
Kia ora, am I audible? Sweet as, I'll take POIs out loud, but I'll take them in the chat actually, but I will let you know when I want to take a POI. Excellent. At the point where Indigenous businesses are bringing home millions a year in tourism, royalties, and local business, at the point where cultural perception of Indigenous people is at an all-time high, and at the point where it is not confusing for us if we refer to the opposition today as Tamaki Makaurau Ma, then we are actually, we think it's completely reprehensible for anyone to be in favour of cutting short these benefits. We are very, very proud to negate this case. All right, first of all, I'm going to talk about the model that they're kind of proposed, just generally, and then I'm going to talk about the cultural benefits that we offer, and then around the economic benefits that are offered by Indigenous tourism, which had very little response until that second speech. All right, let's talk about the model, right? And Stella POIs him before and says, how can you guarantee that we'll get royalties to Indigenous people? Note that there was no real response there. There's no real way that the AF has of replacing and guaranteeing the kind of income that we can guarantee on our side of the house to Indigenous people. What does this mean? Well, money is super important for Indigenous communities because of the scarcity of money in these situations, right? They need this money to be able to support their communities, to be able to support their whānau. That's something that we want to work for, right? Secondly, though, on the model, they ask us why we base our campaign in New Zealand. I just want to clarify because they seem to have misunderstood part of the debate, right? Because we base our case in New Zealand because we have an example of a country that already does this really well, New Zealand. As Isabella proves to you, the reason that we have Indigenous businesses and the reason that we have Indigenous rights and stuff like that is because New Zealand does tourism like that really, really well. So we think that overall, our case is just stronger on that basis, but it's time to get into where we actually clash in this debate, around the cultural issues, right? Because this is where most of the opposition team's time has been spent, right? They tell us that cultural sovereignty is something that almost all Indigenous values. We believe we can win on this debate by improving perceptions, because perceptions in a lot of countries of Indigenous people are so low. They tell us that it takes place in conservative countries. We're willing to stand that characterization. We don't think that it's entirely true, but we're willing to argue on that basis with them. So we're going to focus on cultural perceptions because that's something that's quite important, right? So first of all, and this is one thing that they tell us that we shouldn't engage with Indigenous people's ideas because we'll face conservative backlash. We think it's pretty ridiculous that AF would suggest that Indigenous culture is hidden away in order to protect them from the backlash from conservative whites, right? We think it's ridiculous that we should actually ever hide Indigenous culture and tuck it away so that we can not see, so we can just avoid Indigenous backlash. Right, on the point then that this takes place exclusively in conservative countries, right? Even in these countries, right, we still have young voters. We have a liberal media of some kind that is willing to hold governments to account when they benefit these. And this is ever growing, right? Even in places like Japan and the United States, you still have CNN and you still have whatever the Japanese equivalent of that is, right? So this taking place in conservative countries, though, actually furthers the conversation, right, where it is desperately needed. It is needed most in these countries to have representation because these are the countries that don't have these discussions, as was so eloquently pointed out before. They tell us that there's no political capital for these people, and that they're in places like the United States and in Japan, Indigenous people won't be able to take it to the government. We tell you that they already have, right? The presence of land sovereignty movements in places like Canada and New Zealand has led to the Dakota people in the United States gaining the ability to block a pipeline that was going through their land, to the point where the President of the United States signed an agreement at the start of last month around blocking the Keystone XL pipeline. We tell you that even in conservative countries, this can succeed, right? Okay. Then on stereotypes, right? They tell us that they have all these mechanisms about why these are going to be negative stereotypes. And we agree if they're negative stereotypes, that's bad. But here's what we tell you. One, because of Indigenous ownership of symbols, right? They're actually able to call on the government to better represent them because they have ownership and intellectual property over these, right? So they have a legal basis for being able to take them to court on offensive symbols. I'll get to a little bit of analysis on that later. But also the government just has an incentive to not stereotype Indigenous people because they don't want to create false expectations for the tourists who come to their country, right? If you come to the country expecting happy chappy Māori and you see them being oppressed, then you're not going to be super happy about that. Quickly, a thing on that as well, right? They tell us that having a good public perception of Indigenous people will overrun discussion about why they're not treated well. Aside from the analysis that Isabella already gave you about why this actually highlights that, we tell you that the public isn't actually stupid, right? If they see smiling Māori on posters, they're not going to believe that this is the overall state of the country, right? They're not that stupid, and we think that's a pretty bad characterization on their part. All right. On principle, they tell us that the government has a duty of care to these people and thus they shouldn't advertise them. We think that, yes, they have a duty of care because of the historical wrongdoings. So it's principally wrong for them to ignore this in their marketing. Let's look at the comparative on what their side of the house looks like in terms of international tourists. You see exclusively the faces of colonizers because you don't use Indigenous culture for marketing, right? You see exclusively the colonial culture, which isn't benefiting Indigenous culture in any way, which isn't benefiting equity in any way. That's a massive harm on their side of the house, right? They tell us that the government won't respond or care when this is taken to court, when this is taken to when Indigenous people try to claim their royalties. Here's why they will, right? One, they rely on Indigenous people for tourism, so they actually need to please Indigenous people in some way if they want participation. But B, because there is an increasingly liberal media in each of these countries, and it will side with the underdog, as we hope the adjudicators will in this debate, and change the government's public perception, right? So that makes them actually significantly better in that case. All right, what else do we have on here? I think, at the end of the cultural point, what we tell you is actually we get a better cultural perception of these ethnic minorities, and that's super important for our side of the house. I'll take a POI, then I'll move on.
Given white people control the media and they own the biggest tourism companies, why doesn't tourism money go to those white companies rather than the Indigenous groups that you support?
Glad you asked. I was just about to go into that, right? If people come to the country because they're seeking Indigenous culture, or if they watch media that you tell us will be commercialized because they want to experience Indigenous culture, we tell you that they're probably going to want authenticity, right? That these tourists are probably going to want something that's authentic, that's natural, and so they're going to look for the stuff that's deliberately created by Indigenous creators. This is more true than ever in today's world, right? Because people are more and more conscious, especially tourists, of Indigenous issues, right? And we see this in cases like the United States producing Reservation Dogs, which has been much more successful as an Indigenous produced show than something that would be produced by exclusively white Americans about that. They tell you, the main piece of analysis here and the kind of thing that their debate is contingent on is that Indigenous people just won't make money off this. Well, Isabella already gave you great analysis as to why Indigenous people are able to profit off tourism. But like in the case that we talk about specifically the royalties, things like the Air New Zealand Koto, we tell you that they can A, take the government to court for IP violation, but B, there's a mechanism where they can actually just campaign on the fact that the government is misrepresenting them to get a government that is more favourable to them into power. And this is, again, ever more successful because we have an increasingly politically aware populace, right? They tell us that Indigenous people have no political capital with which to do this. We tell you this is preposterous. They actually do have capital because they have control over the marketing, because they are represented in the marketing of these countries, right? So we are actually giving them political capital with which to argue for their causes on our side of the house. That's something that we really support. All right. At the end of this debate, we have two kind of ways that we can win this, and we believe that we're already kind of winning on both of them, right? Firstly, cultural, right? And we tell you that we get a heightened awareness of Indigenous issues by marketing through Indigenous people, which is super important, right? So we think that we've won on that side, and we think that like any ideas about these being misrepresentations are pretty knocked out of the water already by Isabella's speech. But secondly, on economic values, and this is super important because it didn't receive much playtime from the opposition, right? We tell you that like Isabella's already told you about the massive flow and impacts that this can have in a community, right? Indigenous communities are generally impoverished, and even in AF's best case, where it is slightly principally wrong to appropriate these images, the money that goes into these communities and the benefits that goes into these communities because of that money is still worth it on our side of the house. So we win even in their best case scenario. That's all I've got for you today. Proud to negate.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up the third affirming speaker to close out their team substantive.
We good? Can I be heard and seen? Yep. POIs in the chat, please, but I will ask for them anyway. The burden on this neg team today is to defend government appropriating and commercializing off the cultures that they pillaged, that they murdered, that they stole. They have to defend the Australian government profiting off an appropriate Indigenous culture after not addressing their Aboriginal people as people until the late 1960s. All of their analysis today relied on their blatant place setting in a country where it was incredibly easy and incredibly obvious for government to do this well. When they fail to acknowledge all of the examples and the analysis we give you on why it's likely to be done badly and in pernicious ways, that is when they lost this debate on their failure to engage. I'm going to explain to you why we win in two ways. Firstly, why we win on getting the best outcomes for Indigenous people in terms of regainment of culture. Second, on how we win in terms of getting Indigenous people the best economic outcomes. Either way, we've quite clearly won this debate. Firstly, then, on the issue of social change and the impact on these people's culture. Note their entire case is contingent on proving that they get awareness, but we think awareness only matters insofar as it is good awareness, right? We don't think awareness is particularly useful if it's perpetuating the narrative that your people are savages. We don't think awareness is particularly useful if it means that the global world views your Indigenous people as useless, talentless savages whose only culture and only benefit to society is in the fact that they have a tribal dance. I want to talk firstly about why it is likely to be done badly and in ways that are very reminiscent of cultural appropriation. Because firstly, note that when you use it as like profit off, when you want to profit through tourism, you're likely to present things that are most palatable and appeasing. You're not going to discuss the nuance of someone's culture because that's not going to fit on a billboard. What this means is you're likely to put like a dream catcher up onto like Oklahoma airport when people are landing. This means you're going to have people in headdresses on your billboard because that is obvious, that is palatable, that is visually appealing enough to get you tourism. What it isn't, however, is like nuance, and oftentimes it is an extreme minimization of these people's culture. Secondly, note that like the understanding and engagement of the community is often insufficient in these places. In places like South Africa, where the engagement with the indigenous culture is incredibly minimal, in places such as Australia, where the Aboriginal people are often living in places that are detached and far away from the government, the people who control the way this tourism is operated, often never have any engagement with these people themselves in these indigenous communities. This means their representation is inherently going to be inaccurate, and even if it is accurate because they like did some Google research, it's not going to accurately reflect what these people want. No, on our side of the house, when we're happy to support these indigenous groups having proprietorship of their own culture and presenting their own culture when they control the avenues of tourism, that means you're always going to get a more accurate depiction on our side of the house. Thirdly, note, it always has to be untrue to some extent because oftentimes these cultures have been pillaged and have been destroyed through years of colonization and oppression, which means when you do want to present them to some degree, unless you want to show the fact that your country has history of extreme atrocity and murder and oppression, you're always going to have to sanitize it to some degree. We think that's incredibly oppressive and means that it's often done badly. Fourthly, note that the government and like white-owned businesses have more resources. So if the tourism is centered around the culture, it's likely that these like white-owned businesses and government-owned businesses are going to hold the proprietorship and are going to get the most at revenue when this is done. This means that even if indigenous communities are also doing it on their side of the house, those communities are going to get less attention because the businesses with more resources are always going to get more attention due to the fact they have more marketing capacity. They have more capacity to like put their shops next to the airport. That just means that when these communities have to compete with the government for this tourism, they always lose out on revenue, and these groups are able to appropriate to a larger extent. Fifthly, if you address these atrocities and you contradict your tourism, so you never actually end up addressing these atrocities. This means insofar as you are putting this on your tourism front, insofar as you have it on your billboards, you're never able to address those atrocities because if a tourist sees a positive portrayal and then comes to your country and sees news articles about how your people are oppressed, that contradicts the view, and it means governments now have an incentive to try and sanitize and oppress some of those upcoming voices so their like portrayal of tourism is more accurate. And finally, let's flag here that lots of countries aren't accountable because the majority populace does not care about these like tokenized groups, right? If you minimize the indigenous people of a country to one token, the majority of that country is only going to see them as that token. That means when you have discussions around like political change and legislative change, these individuals no longer care about this group because this group is simply a headdress. This group is simply a dream catcher. This group is simply a motif that you use to make a profit. Furthermore, then I'd like to talk about why indigenous people are better off on our side, because they seem to think they're going to win by saying indigenous people are going to get awareness is better for them. I've already explained to you why it's not awareness, it's a cultural appropriation and lost proprietorship. Let's elaborate more on this though. Firstly, because on our side of the house, when we support them doing so exclusively and on themselves, they retain sole proprietorship, right? This means now that if anyone wants to access minority culture, they have to go directly to the minority themselves. They have to interact with this minority community, they have to respect this minority community, and the revenue goes directly to them. Secondly, because they don't have to compete with the appropriated culture. What we see in the world today is that once culture is appropriated, oftentimes the gentrified and altered version that's often like assimilated with the majority culture gets more traction and gets more capital. This means in a world where both the appropriated culture and the original culture exist, the appropriated version often gets more revenue. That in itself is harmful because it means on their side of the house, they have to defend a world in which minority groups and indigenous communities are competing to get attention for their own culture. Thirdly, we think like they get some nuance and like a more platform when they have sole proprietorship. This means if tourists want to see your culture, they have to go to you. This means when they go to you, you can tell them about all the oppression. You can tell them about how it's pillaged away from you. And we think there are incentives in place that mean that this culture is always going to get acknowledged when they have proprietorship. Firstly, because as they themselves said, they're like rising trends and people wanting to be politically correct and wanting to engage with like this media. And secondly, because oftentimes these indigenous groups can provide unique avenues for revenue and like unique merchandise that the government cannot. That means on our side of the house, we're happy to support indigenous businesses doing so. And finally, in the majority of countries, the minority the government is able to take this revenue and put it back into the government and put it in things like the police, which then goes and commits police brutality against these same indigenous communities. It's a feedback loop of the government profiting off these indigenous groups and then exploiting these indigenous groups with that same money. At the end of this point, then, we think on our side of the house, we maintain your capacity to get legislative change because you have sole proprietorship. We maintain your culture and the integrity of your culture. And we think inherently all awareness is not good awareness. What we want is awareness that is accurate. We want awareness that is nuanced. We are not happy to support a world in which appropriation exists. I'll take a point now if you have one.
Why would the government portray Indigenous people as savages if they want to attract people to the country?
Two things. Firstly, portraying them as savages minimizes them and makes it incredibly palatable. It's a unique selling point you can provide because you're like, look, our people are the most primitive. They have this newest technology to make fire. That's a unique selling point. Secondly, we think even if it's not as extreme as like promoting them as savages, it's like minimizing them to headdresses, right? It's minimizing this like the South African indigenous cultures to like one tribal art. It's things like saying that this culture is only like their one song they sing, right? Any minimization is bad minimization in that it loses you nuance. Finally, I want to talk about economic benefits and profit. This is margin building on our already clear win here. But let's talk about how, like on our side of the house, tourists are able to are better able to engage with this culture, and now such the profit goes directly to these communities. Firstly, we think that on our side of the house, when you have sole proprietorship, and as I've explained earlier, the groups have to go directly to you. This means Indigenous owned businesses inherently get better profits, and these profits aren't going back and being taxed to the government at the point at which they're able to then exploit these communities more. At the end of the speech, then, we win by proving, we win by avoiding cultural appropriation. We win by protecting culture. So proud. Propose.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up the final substantive speaker of the debate, third negating.
All right, guys, I just need a minute to set up my paper. I'll be ready to go in about 20 seconds. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. So the setup they've tried to sell us today is that this vote is not relevant to New Zealand and that it is more relevant to countries where the governments do not engage with their Indigenous cultures, right? We tell you that, first of all, it is extremely relevant to New Zealand because New Zealand is an example where we do use our Indigenous cultures for promotion of tourism and for marketing of tourism, and it actually benefits everyone. And that is why it is super important, because we provide a comparison to their side of the house, right? So on their side of the house, we see things like America, where everything is repressed. You don't see it used as in tourism. You see them, and so you just don't see it in the media, in the markets. You just see none of this, right? And that is why New Zealand is important. It sets an international standard that other countries can compare against, right? So I'm just going to talk about this a little bit more before I move into my 2 points on tourism and representation, okay? So I'm just going to talk a bit about the setup, right? They've tried to tell us that it's, terrible for these countries, but why is it good for countries that don't engage with their Indigenous cultures to actually start doing so? Why do we support this, right? Well, first of all, it is a way that they can promote their country, okay? Indigenous cultures are being used for promotion and marketing because they get tourists there, right? They provide a unique aspect to a country which encourages people to come. And this is a good thing, and governments will portray them well because the government wants people to come to a country that seems really nice, that seems happy, not to a country where, as the affirmative has characterized it, people dance around fires, they are savages, all this. The government simply will not do this because it creates a terrible rep for their country, okay? The next thing is people like new and unique things, right? The attraction of Indigenous cultures. And that is why people will come to the country. And that is the incentive that I've just talked about for why the government would start to engage with these Indigenous cultures, okay? Because it will increase tourism and it will bring money to their country, okay? So here, the other thing is that when they don't engage with it, it leads to tokenism and mischaracterization, okay? And this is what I'm about to move into now, okay? So now I'm going to talk about the representation and how this affects people, okay? Their characterization of the ads were things like dance around fires, savages, dream catchers, headdresses. Okay, this is so inherently racist in itself. Okay, this is a complete mischaracterization. What we really see, and New Zealand is a good example of this, we see the haka, we see koru, we see the language being provided, we see music and films, all of this to get tourists to come, right? We see music festivals that promote the Māori language, and this is what we need, okay? This creates a sense of pride. This is not what governments are going to do, okay? It's not likely when governments are, first of all, accountable on an international stage, okay? They're not going to promote it bad. Second of all, people won't come based off a terrible representation of a country that Indigenous people are really harmful, they're aggressive. People won't come to this. Therefore, governments have no incentive to do this. Just because it's an easy thing, that does not make it an incentive, okay? The incentive is to get more people to come, and that is why governments will portray them in a positive way, okay? The second thing they told us is that Indigenous cultures don't actually need the government to promote culture, to promote their culture, and that is why tourism should not be used, right? My only response here is really, they can't do this on a global stage, right? So if a culture can't promote it on a global stage because they have no backing from the government, this just means that they simply can't promote it, right? It's a pretty simple thing. And they provided no mechanisms of how they would be able to promote it on a global stage. And that is why we win this point, okay? Next thing, governments would be shunned. Governments used to shun the language and now they want to use it for profit. They phrase this in a really bad way, but honestly, we don't see the issue, right? With the governments correcting their wrongdoing, you know, is the affirming team trying to tell us that they would prefer to continue this repression rather than expressing the culture and engaging with the culture? We don't see this being a valid point for them. In fact, we see this being a win for us because it would encourage people to engage with the culture. Then kind of adding on to that, onto my fourth point here, and my last point is about how people won't react well to, they use the example of Native Americans being promoted, okay? That is a key reason why we need this promotion, why we need this marketing on an international stage, because it sets it as a token of pride for your country, right? The same way that the haka is seen as a symbol of pride in New Zealand, and actually people from all different cultures use it and see it as a sense of pride, which is really, really beneficial to the Indigenous cultures in these countries because it gets their word out. It makes them more visible on an international stage, and it allows them to talk about their issues, which is what I'm going to go into soon, okay? They told us that cultures become whitewashed. We don't really see this. We see white people engaging with these cultures, and that is a great thing for the cultures themselves. They have completely mischaracterized what will happen there, and they phrase it in a negative way when in fact it is a harm to their side, okay? So then just to kind of recap this, right? Why can Indigenous people communicate their history of oppression when they get this representation, right? So on our side, why can they use this representation for good? First of all, it puts them on a world stage, okay? This means that the government is then held accountable on a world stage in media throughout the world. It also puts them in media, both nationally and internationally. This is a really good thing because a government is encouraged to do it well, because if they're portrayed badly in media, they will simply be out of government. The people of the country won't vote for them again. And so they really have no incentive to do this. Thirdly, it provides comparisons, right? New Zealand is then used as a comparison for other countries, and also within the country, it's a comparison between how they're portrayed and how the actuality of their culture, okay? And what this leads to is if there is huge misrepresentation, people can take them to courts, okay? An example of this, right, is in the USA, the Dakota people took it to court because the government was doing Keystone pipelining in their lands. They took it to court. Joe Biden recently signed an executive order for this to be removed. That is a great example of how this can be used on an international stage, and they can use examples where in other cultures, such as in New Zealand, Māori actually have rights over their land, and this benefits internationally, okay? So now moving into my second point of flash about tourism, okay? So the question we should have in mind here, right, is tourism actually a good platform, and how does it impact where the money goes and how it impacts the Indigenous people, okay? So they told us from the very beginning that tourism money is taxed, but it goes into the government, right? So it doesn't go to Indigenous people. First of all, we've told you from first that there are royalties, right? People have sued for this. They now have to pay a royalty for every time the koru is used, right? We see this going directly into the Indigenous people's pockets. This does not all go to the government, right? And even if, like at our worst case, right, most of the money goes to the government, it actually goes to the New Zealand or wherever the country is economy, which is a good thing for everyone. And even that little bit of money is more than they can prove on their side of the house. And therefore we win no matter what, because we provide at least some benefit in our worst case. All right. Not that this would happen. We would actually see much more than this, but that is just in our worst. Okay. The second thing is that they rebutted our point about how people would visit things like the Rotorua village, right? And they simply said that they actually won't go here because advertising promotes museums and stuff. First of all, I've never seen advertising on TV or anything for a museum, right? We don't promote our museums on an international stage. What we do promote is the haka. We promote these realistic and actual Māori things, okay? Secondly, we tell you that people would simply rather do an interactive activity like touring a village rather than going into a museum and looking at a glass box, right? We just don't see this as making sense in the real world. People would much rather do an interactive activity where they can talk to real people and, you know, about the issues than just staring at a glass box, okay? And then I'm just gonna say, even at our worst, right? We're one, even if they do just go to the museums, right? They actually learn about the history. They at least get some secondhand culture experience. And this is so, so much better than completely repressing it. And we would see none of this on their side of the house. At our worst case, our side of the house allows people to learn about the culture, okay? Second of all, even if only like the 1% of people visit these Rotorua villages, right? Even if the majority of people only go to the museums, that money, those few people that do go there are putting money directly into the indigenous economies, okay? And this is something that is exclusive to our side of the house and cannot happen on their side if they do not promote it, if they do not market it. Therefore, there will not be tourism and people will just not go there, okay? And that is why we win, because on our side of the house, we at least provide some benefits in our very worst case that they simply cannot provide on their side of the house. Thank you.
Awesome. I thank the speaker very much for their speech. Now, as is traditional in schools debating, we will reverse the speaking order, so I ask up the negating team's leaders reply.
Am I actually visible? I can't see myself. Oh, I can see myself. There we go. You know who else can't see themselves? Indigenous people on their side of the house. All right. Look, it's indisputable that the key stakeholder in this debate is Indigenous communities. There are two ways that our debate uniquely benefits Indigenous people, economically and culturally, right? We think that it's important to note that at least 1/3 of AF's debate revolves around principle, right? That it's just wrong for a government to, quote unquote, appropriate these cultures, despite the fact that we've already proven to you, obviously, that cultures get revenue out of this, that they get a significant amount of benefit in return for that. We tell you that actually, like, given that we end up with money in the pockets of like impoverished Indigenous communities, we think that even in their best case, where they're able to prove that there's like a slight like wrong on this side, we think that the actual amount of like power that we can bring to Indigenous communities in places like Japan and the Hokkaido region, or in places like the United States and the Dakota, we actually think we get like a significantly better benefit on our side of the house. All right, let's focus on the economic benefit here, because this is like one that we didn't really receive any kind of substantial analysis from Affirmative on. We got a little bit at third, but it was kind of too late by then to actually establish any kind of points here. But what Isabella brought to you from first, right, was that like, first of all, we get the logos from like, we get the revenues from like tourism logos, from waiata, from things like that being used, symbols of the culture that are actually intellectual property and like therefore under common law have to be respected. We also get those Indigenous businesses which people are likely to go to. We proved you that like people are more likely to go to these things than others because of the demand for authenticity and because of the demand for like a real experience, right? They tell you that like Indigenous people won't gain because the government will take most of the revenues. Like, we obviously have proven to you that this is not true, but even in the sense that this is like the absolute, like even in the sense that like they get 99% of the revenues, that 1% is still more than you get on their side of the house. It is still 1% more going to Indigenous people's like children who are starving. It's going to like people's like actual families. And that is something that we are really, really proud to support, even in the absolute worst case scenario. Now on cultural, because given that we've clearly won the economic point, this is the only point that they can actually have any chance of winning on, right? The key question here is, what do these portrayals look like? AF tells you that like these are racist stereotypes, and they use pretty racist examples in describing them, right? We tell you like, obviously this makes no sense. Like, governments aren't going to give positive portrayals of, governments are going to give positive portrayals of something because it gets more tourism into the country. People want to see a culture that's fun to interact with, that has beautiful native culture, and like, because of this, they're going to have to take some sort of accountability, so we get a massive cultural impact on our side of the house, right? They didn't tell us that this debate takes place like exclusively in conservative countries. And I think it's important here to look at what like Stella has reminded you and what I've reminded you, but also to remember that New Zealand used to be one of these countries, right? But we prioritize Māori identity in our like fundraising, in our tourism, and we had these massive flow-on effects. We had the things like kapahaka coming into schools. We had all these massive effects where money goes to Māori businesses. And we stand like no reason to believe that this could not happen in other formerly conservative countries like the United States, like Japan, we think that as part of this transition, we need to start acknowledging Indigenous identity. And so we are like proud to support that on our side of the house. So at the end, what does this look like? Firstly, like we realize that we actually get more money in the pockets of Indigenous people, which is like more than enough to win this debate. But secondly, like we actually get better portrayals than no portrayal, but we actually get like really positive portrayals that encourage people's cultures to persevere. But like secondly, we also get conservative countries to become less conservative and actually like generally share their values and share their national identity with the Indigenous people of that country. We think that that's something super important, and we're proud, so proud to negate.
Awesome, thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up the final speech of the debate, Affirmative Leaders Reply.
We're good? Opposition loses this debate by refusing to engage with the contextualization that I bring you at first. Because in New Zealand, what the government does probably doesn't make a big influence to how Maori people are seen, because Maori people can present that narrative anyways, comparatively in incredibly conservative places such as the US, such as Australia, such as Canada, such as Japan. In these places, what the government implements in tourism makes a huge difference to how these people are seen. Notice that there's way more conservative countries than New Zealand. Clearly, then, they cannot just set this debate in New Zealand. Saying that Maori people can sue Air New Zealand for royalty because Air New Zealand uses the koru doesn't quite cut it. Okay. I'm going to answer two questions in the speech. Firstly, on which side gets more social change, and secondly, on which side gets economic benefit, if there's economic benefit at all. Firstly, then, on social change. What we tell you is that, what I tell you at first is that these people are stereotyped by government representation, and they reduce the stereotypes such as hairdressers, such as dream catchers. We say that when the government uses them to advertise, we create a falsely positive impression of that culture and of that people, which means that both the Indigenous people and the government are likely to sell a positive version of these peoples because they want tourists to come in for a good time. That means that representation is necessarily over positive. It means that you get less discussion of like the real problems that face these people, and you also give the right wing more ammunition to like minimize these people's oppression. What did we hear? We heard two things from opposition. One, they told us that they got more awareness, and so they were more able to solve these problems. Secondly, they told you that like Indigenous groups could now compare the difference between the portrayal and the reality. We gave you a few responses. First, Nicole points out that awareness isn't useful insofar as people aren't seen as people, but seen as caricatures. At the point where your only worth in that country is as a caricature that the country can do as, I don't see why people really care about these Indigenous groups. But secondly, that all their analysis ignores my analysis that I brought you from first, and we continue down the line about how people got decreased political capital. That is to say, one, right-wing trolls use portrayals of Indigenous people by the government to say that these Indigenous people are actually pretty well off and therefore don't need extra rights. I think they never engage with that. I notice that this is most impactful in conservative places, right? But also secondly, they ignored our analysis. They ignored our analysis on how it's impossible for both like the government and the Indigenous group to acknowledge suffering, because as third negative admits herself, that these Indigenous groups need to paint a picture of happiness to attract people to these places. I think when you have to paint a picture of happiness, negative can't then tell you that like these people must also say that they're very oppressed. Clearly there is a tension. I told you that there is a tension at first. They never resolve this tension. What that means is that they get less political capital to get like social change overall. I notice that social change is the most important issue in this debate, right? We tell you that Indigenous people are oppressed by racist laws and systems. Social change is the way we stop the majority of Indigenous people from being discriminated against the street, from being profiled by police, from being locked out from jobs by racist employers. Clearly, social change is the most important issue in the debate. All they can win on is like enriching a couple of very privileged tourism operators. Clearly, panel weigh the impacts. Secondly, then, So clearly we've won on social change, but secondly, let's deal with their material and economic benefit. They tell you that they get more tourism money, they get more money from cultural exports. That's not true. Nicole, one first tells you that a lot of tourists probably just go to the white places because those places have more money to promote themselves, those places have more legitimacy, and because white tourists probably feel more comfortable in like tours run by white people, therefore these indigenous groups don't actually get money. But secondly, I told you in a POI that these indigenous communities don't own like hotels, and Manat builds on that by saying that these indigenous hotels are often underfunded and therefore outcompeted by the ones that are like owned by the government. I think the impact of all of that is that they don't actually get the economic benefits, right? They don't actually get the economic benefits, or if at best it's metric. I think therefore, panel, we win on social change. We help indigenous communities propose.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for the debate. I'm just gonna leave it running for a few seconds so the stream can catch up and see the end of that reply. But I just want to congratulate everyone for it was a really good debate.
Sure, Lily.
Well, then,
Good job, guys. Thank you for the great debate.
I'll just pop out for a moment and then I'll be back to give an oral.
Thank you.
Thanks, girl.